If the Bible is such a good book, then why did the law of Moses allow slavery? If the Bible is such a good book, then why doesn't it say anything useful about care for the environment? And if the Bible is such a good book, then why is its advice concerning issues like child raising, marriage, and divorce so out of date? These are the kinds of questions we're confronted by when we are living in modern society. And these are the kinds of questions that are thrown at our young people, especially not only in university, but of course even in high school and primary school. And these represent serious challenges to our belief and to our faith. And they marginalize us as well, and they put us on the edge of society. And these issues, these challenges can make us deeply uncomfortable, especially, I guess, in North America, concerning the subject of slavery and the history of this country. It's particularly awkward when you're trying to deal with these questions and you're confronted with unpleasant and inconvenient Bible verses. So what I'd like to do in this presentation is have a look at some of these issues. I'd like to look at some ethical issues, starting with the topic of slavery. And I'd like to look at environmental issues to see exactly what does the Bible say in terms of the environment. And I'd like to look at social issues such as marriage and divorce and child raising. And let's see if the Bible's advice really is so out of date. I'd like to start with that very difficult subject for many people, the issue of slavery. Now, what we need to understand, first of all, is that the Bible did not ever actually condone slavery as we understand it. The slavery of the North American plantations and indeed the English colonies is referred to as chattel slavery. And it was referred to as chattel slavery because it meant the slave was your property. The slave was basically a piece of furniture. They had no rights and no legal protections whatsoever. And characteristic of slavery is that it is a servitude which is non-voluntary. You didn't agree to it, and you have no way out of it. Biblical servitude, on the other hand, is completely different. Under the law of Moses, nobody could forcibly enslave you. Nobody could force you into being your servant. Under the law of Moses, the only reason why you entered into a form of servitude was either because you had to pay off a debt, or as a thief, you were providing restoration for what you stole. So under the law of Moses, you could only enter into servitude voluntarily. Additionally, under the law of Moses, servitude was always limited by time. And indeed, every 7 years, all servants under the law of Moses, all servants would have their debt forgiven. And all servants, for whatever reason, under the Jubilee law, of course, were released no matter how long they had served. So there was a provision under the law of Moses which provided protection for servants so that they would never be permanently the servants of another person. And this differentiates the servitude of the law of Moses significantly from what we know as slavery. So let's have a look at what these Bible passages really say in summary. Under biblical servitude, kinship rights and marriage rights were preserved. There was physical protection for the servant, and there were laws against breach of conduct by the master. The master could not treat their servant as their personal property. And even if they ever inflicted permanent damage on their servant, they had to immediately let them go. Additionally, under the law of Moses, all servants had freedom of movement and access to liberty. Most notably, under the law of Moses, if a servant ran away from his master, the master was not allowed to get him back, was not allowed to pursue him, and anyone finding that servant was forbidden to return him to his master. Anyone finding that servant had to let him go. He was now considered a free man. So remarkably, under the law of Moses, the easiest way to get out of being a servant was simply to leave, to run away. If you believed you were being treated unfairly, you could leave, and the law gave you complete protection. You were not to be returned to your master, and you were to live wherever you wanted to as a free man. Additionally, in several passages of Scripture, chattel slavery is explicitly forbidden. And most especially, under the law of Moses, the death penalty was enforced for people who enslaved others. If you captured someone to make them a slave, or if you made someone a slave against their will, under the law of Moses, you were put to death. Now that one law, if it had ever been enacted in North America, would have completely destroyed the North American slave trade, and would have completely destroyed the slave trade of the British colonies. If there had been a law in North America and England that said anybody who forced another man into slavery must be put to death, the entire system would never have got off the ground. And now let's read some professional scholarly commentary so we know we are not simply imposing our own ideas on the text. The nations subjected by the Israelites were considered slaves. They were, however, not slaves in the proper meaning of the term, although they were obliged to pay royal taxes and to perform public works. And he says they were not slaves in the proper meaning of the term because they didn't actually belong to anyone. They still had their own houses, they were allowed to keep property, they had certain legal rights and protections, they had freedom of movement, and nobody was actually allowed to force them to do what they didn't want to do. And again, another article in a standard professional scholarly journal says, those people who were enslaved in ancient Israel had a social and legal status different from that of the chattel slaves who made up the system practiced later in Hellenistic Roman times. Slavery in Hellenistic Roman times was indeed absolutely dreadful, but it was very different to the servitude in the law of Moses. On the contrary, we find, scholars say, we have in the Bible the first appeals in world literature to treat slaves as human beings for their own sake and not just in the interests of their masters. And again, very bluntly, under the law of Moses, kidnapping for slavery was deemed an offence worthy of death because it threatened the very integrity of the community. And it cites the two passages there in the law of Moses which forbade anybody from enslaving anyone against their will. It was simply not possible under the law of Moses to force somebody to become your servant. Indeed, on the contrary, as Fry Mackenzie tells us, under the law of Moses, a slave could also be freed by running away. According to Deuteronomy, a runaway slave is not to be returned to its master. He should be sheltered if he wishes, or allowed to go free, and he must not be taken advantage of. So there's a range of scholarly commentary which assures us that the servitude laws under the law of Moses were nothing like what we know as slavery, were completely different to the laws of all the other nations around them, and were remarkable in providing the widest possible range of protections and legal rights for people who were servants. And of course, under the law of Moses, even if you had to place yourself under servitude for a debt, the person whose servant you were was not allowed to keep you for more than 7 years. After 7 years, even if your debt was not paid, your master still had to let you go. So nobody was committed to a permanent life of slavery. And nobody could be enforced into servitude against their will. This actually resulted in a significant change in Roman law as Christians from the 1st century or onwards started to challenge openly the Roman slavery system. From the 1st to the 2nd centuries, Christian leaders freed their own slaves. From the 2nd to the 4th century, Christians used to raise money to buy slaves from other people and free them. From the 2nd to the 4th century, Christian leaders wrote many letters condemning slavery. And from the 4th to the 7th century, Christians managed to get slave laws changed. Not abolished in all cases, but at least in some cases weakened and made more acceptable. So we can find that the Bible's teaching led in one clear direction, to the overturning of slavery in its worst and most vile forms. And if this had been followed by the later British traders and by the North American traders and plantation owners, then the slavery that we know of and condemn would never have existed. And in fact, it's remarkable that the 17th century saw the first emergence of plantation slavery in the Christian world. Previously, it simply didn't exist because of the great work of these earlier Christians. So for the person who tries to tell you that the Bible encourages and enforces slavery on others, and the Bible is deeply corrupting and it inevitably results in the slavery of people, and all the slavery in the Christian world can rightly be laid at the feet of the Bible, you have to ask them, well, why is it then? Why is it that the law of Moses says something completely different? Why is it that if the law of Moses had been followed in North America, plantation slavery could never have existed? And why is it especially, if the Bible's teaching on servitude is so bad, why is it that it led Christians from the 1st to 7th century to free their own slaves, to buy and free other people's slaves, and to change slavery legislation? That is a dramatic vindication of the Bible's teaching. Christians could gain no personal advantage by freeing their own slaves, no personal advantage by buying other people's slaves and freeing them, and certainly no personal advantage by abolishing laws which actually let them own slaves. And yet, this is what they were led to by the Bible's own teaching. And while we're on the subject of what the Bible says about the disadvantaged and the poor and needy, let's have a look at those Bible teachings. Let's have a look at what the Bible actually does teach about social welfare. The law of Moses had a social security system. That social security system was available, as the law of Moses tells us, for the stranger, the widow, and the fatherless. The stranger was anybody who was not a Hebrew. That's right, the law of Moses had a social security system for illegal immigrants. And of course, under the law of Moses, in actual fact, there was no such thing as a legal immigrant. The law of Moses says, if a foreigner wishes to come and live peaceably among you and accept our laws, then he may do so. There was no such thing as an illegal immigrant. And there was a social security system which was available for all people. This social security system said that when you planted your fields and then you harvested the crops, you were to leave the corners of your field unharvested. You had to deliberately leave food for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. And anybody who was in need, passing through your crops, could glean and take whatever you had left and take freely for themselves, so that they would be cared for. For, says God, I am the Lord your God, and I brought you out of Egypt, and you should remember the hardship that you had in those times. And so you should feel sympathy for those who are in need. So the Bible, and especially under the law of Moses, had a social security system which is unequaled in the modern world today. There is not a civilized nation in the Western world or anywhere else which had a social security system as generous as the law of Moses. Throughout the Bible, from the law of Moses onward, there is a repeated exhortation for the obligation to care for the poor and the needy. And likewise, repeatedly throughout the law of Moses and the Old Testament, there is insistence that those who are marginal in society, that especially the stranger, the fatherless, the widow, the poor and the needy, are to be protected from exploitation. The debt relief legislation under the law of Moses meant that nobody had to serve under a crushing debt. Even if your debt would take you 20 years to pay off, you only ever had to serve a maximum of 7. And after that 7 years, your master would let you go, and he would forgive the rest of your debt, no matter how high it was. I don't know any banks which would allow you that kind of generosity. Otherwise, I'd certainly be buying a house. So we can see, in fact, that the law of Moses, far from being some primitive and pre-medieval and harsh, restrictive legislation, actually provided a social security system and a debt relief system which is far in advance of any belonging to any modern nation today. And this is something you really need to point out if somebody challenges you in this regard. If somebody wants to challenge you over the law of Moses, say, well, actually, could you point to a nation which has such a generous social security system? Can you point to any nation on the planet which has a debt relief legislation as generous as this one? And again, this had a distinct social impact, and there is a historic record of this. As a result of biblical teaching on these matters, Christians became known for their poverty relief and for their charity. From the 1st to the 4th century, Christian poverty relief was organised. Christians actually gathered money together and they would buy goods which would be distributed to the poor and needy. From the 2nd to the 4th century, pagans ridiculed the Christian charity which they saw in the Roman Empire. And we saw some of that last night when we saw Lucian, the Roman Pope Lucian, ridiculing the generosity of Christians, which he simply couldn't understand. And we saw the pagan Roman Emperor Julian the Apostate in the 4th century criticizing his own fellow pagans that they were not as generous as the Christians. And from the 6th to the 9th century, Christians began to organize public charities and hospitals which were available to anybody, no matter what their social status. And this really demonstrates, doesn't it, brothers and sisters, that the Bible's teachings had a good social impact. And there's plenty of historical information demonstrating this. And so anybody challenging us over the Bible's ethical teachings, especially the ethical teachings of the Old Testament and the Law of Moses, really needs to be confronted with the historical facts. Christians were gaining no personal advantage from doing this. Christians gained no personal advantage from staying in cities which were beset by plague and caring for the poor and needy. Christians gained no personal advantage by gathering money for poor relief and for public charity. So we can see that the Bible's teaching in these respects, the Bible's teaching on these subjects, led to significant social relief. Now, on the subject of modern society, we may again turn the tables somewhat and point out that modern society is in fact facing something of an ethical dilemma and an ethical catastrophe. I'm sure we're all aware that one of the major problems in modern society is the fact that there is a distinct difference between what is considered legal and what is considered moral. And the problem is that corporations in particular are allowed to take advantage of laws which actually let them do immoral things. Here we have an example, a very famous example, which was the cause of considerable controversy. American Airlines gave 45 top executives $100 million in bonuses and pension payments, even as it accepted at the same time federal bailouts and labour concessions because it couldn't even afford to pay its own workers. And this article goes on to say, was what they did legal? Yes, it was. But was it moral? No, it wasn't. Social commentators, particularly in the field of ethics, acknowledge there is a serious problem with the modern legal system which lets people perform immoral acts. And this commentator said Solzhenitsyn, that's Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the famous Russian commentator, writer and ethicist, said that if the United States only aspires to a legal standard of moral excellence, we will have missed the point. If the only thing you do is confine your actions to what is legal, then can you really say that you are a moral person? Man can do better. We believe you have to aspire to something higher than what is legal. Is what you are doing actually right? But modern society has a problem, and that problem is modern society does not actually teach morality, and it does not actually teach ethics. And the problem is that modern society is trying to solve with laws a problem that can only be solved by addressing the issue at its source, the heart and mind, as we saw yesterday in one of our presentations. The whole point about the Bible, the reason why the Bible's approach to morality works, is because it works on effecting change from within, instead of simply trying to restrain people with external legislation. This commentator says, but regulators cannot legislate good ethics. Principles must come before regulation. Without the proper ethical culture to serve as an anchor, regulation ultimately will be ineffective. All the ethical legislation that has been written still hasn't solved the problem. People still do bad things. Why? Because they haven't really been changed at the personal level. As a result, when push comes to shove, they will do what is necessary for them to gain their personal advantage, especially in business. You need to change people first in order to change how they act morally. And so this commentator says, we constantly legislate morality. However, the legislation would be more effective if we conscientiously taught morality through the process of teaching values. And that's exactly what the Bible says. That's exactly what the Bible does. And that's exactly why the law of Moses had its limitations. And that's why God said, I don't want you simply to obey my laws and regulations. What is the point, said God, of performing all those sacrifices and rituals if your heart has not been changed? And this brings us back to the point that was made by Alain de Botton, which we saw yesterday, the fact that the state and modern ethical systems are completely ineffective to address this problem. Contrast, he says, consider by contrast, he says, how belatedly and how bluntly the modern state enters into our lives with its injunctions. It intervenes when it is already far too late. The Bible intervenes at the point when we first had the thought to do wrong. That is the only point at which legislation can be effective. But it has to be not mere legislation, but an inner change. It has to be not mere legislation, but inspiration. You actually have to get people to want to act morally. You have to inspire them with personal example. And that's exactly what the Bible does. After you have made the law, it's far too late to start punishing people. You cannot simply effect moral change by giving people commandments. And the law of Moses itself demonstrated that very, very clearly. And that was, of course, the message of the Lord Jesus Christ. He said, forget about what the law says after you've committed adultery. It's far too late then. You need to start thinking. You need to realize that when you have already had the thought, that's the sin right there. That's where you have to nip it in the bud. That's the problem. So modern society has, in fact, no good answer to the challenges of ethics and morality. Only an effectual change from within can overcome that problem. And that is explicitly the change that the Bible teaches. Now, the Bible has been criticized for having very little to say on environmental issues. And some people will even say that the Bible's silence on environmental issues has actually caused considerable damage to the environment. We can confidently dismiss these people as ignorant because the Bible in fact has a considerable array of teaching on environmental issues and is in fact a model of environmental care. Now let's have a look at the law of Moses. The law of Moses says that animals, even those animals that are your servants, are not to be exploited. You are not to yoke the ass with the ox, because the inequality of the two animals will only cause difficulty to both of them. The ox will be slowed down by the ass, which can't keep up and can't bear the same burden, and the ass will be overburdened because it doesn't have the strength of the ox. And of course, Jesus himself appealed to the fact that the law says that you must take care of your animals, and even if you saw a beast of burden which was in trouble and had fallen into a hole, even if that beast of burden belonged to your enemy, you must still relieve it. Because your personal enmity with your neighbor is irrelevant. You must take care of the animal for its own sake. The law of Moses also says that during war, you must assure the environment of certain protection. The law of Moses says, when you come to a city and you are laying siege against it, and you want to build siege works, and you want to cut down trees in order to lay siege against the city, you must not cut down any fruit-bearing trees. And the law of Moses gives two reasons for this. Firstly, it says the trees are not your enemy, so you should not treat them as your enemy. You can't just simply wantonly cut down all the trees you want for your personal advantage. They didn't do anything to you, so you need to treat them with care. Secondly, the law of Moses says if you cut down all the fruit-bearing trees, then after you've taken the city, what are you going to eat? So the law of Moses gives intelligent and sensible environmental protection and encourages the environment to be protected even during times of war. And if that legislation had followed, you can guarantee that a good number of countries would look very different today. The law of Moses also gives compulsory rest to the land. Of course, every 7 years there was a Sabbath of the land, during which time you were not permitted to plant any crops, and you had to let the land take its rest. So the land would not be overburdened by reaping and sowing and cultivation. The land would have its rest, and so the land would be able to renew itself and not be overexploited. And of course, there are thousands of acres and hectares all over the earth which are now impossible for cultivation because they have been overexploited and they have not been given their rest. So apart from these clear examples of environmental care in the law of Moses, let's look now at some standard professional commentaries and what they say about the Bible and environmental care. This book on biodiversity and conservation says, why do I keep doing that? It says, the Bible, without which Western civilization is inexplicable, has powerful ecological teachings that support an ecological worldview, not a utilitarian worldview. In other words, it supports a view that cares for the environment instead of simply viewing the earth as a resource for us to exploit. And this commentator on ecology in ancient Judaism says, archaeological records show that the Israelites were the first example in world history of a society that succeeded in managing a sustained management of their environment for about 1,700 years. That's quite a track record. Western civilization hasn't even managed that for 50 years. And again, talking about the law of Moses and its animal welfare legislation, this commentator says, the law of Moses contrasts favourably with the attitude toward animals that prevailed in the Western world all the way up to the 19th century. Before that time, according to the historian Cecil Roth, cruelty to animals was nowhere illegal except under Jewish law. And again, we can see that the law of Moses was way ahead of its time, not only in terms of environmental care and ecological preservation, but also in its attitude to animal welfare. Modern Western society didn't catch up with the law of Moses until the 19th century. And there are many historical examples of this in Jewish and Christian commentary. There is commentary in the Mishnah and the Talmuds, and among the medieval rabbis Rashi, Maimonides, Ibn Ezra, Nachmanides, and Abravanel. These are the prominent medieval rabbis who commented on the ecological and environmental legislation in the law of Moses, as well as its animal welfare legislation. Among Christians, ecological preservation and environmental care and animal welfare were all causes taken up by the Franciscans, the Benedictines, the Quakers, the Mennonites, and many of the 19th century Christians during the Radical Reformation. So we can see not only do professional commentaries demonstrate to us clearly that the Bible contains strong ecological and animal welfare legislation, but also we can see historically this has been for the advantage of the environment and of animals. And we can see that, in fact, modern society has taken a very long time to catch up with what the Bible was saying all along. So, when we are challenged by the claim that the Bible contains no care for the environment or disregards animal welfare, we can demonstrate that this claim is false very clearly. We can quote the relevant passages from the Bible, and then we can say, well, if you don't want to believe me, you can have a look at these standard scholarly commentaries, and then we can cite the historical evidence for the favourable impact on the ecology, environment, and animal welfare that biblical teaching had. And we can mention as an aside that it's good to see modern society finally catching up with the Bible. Now let's look at social issues, and I'm going to spend most of my time on this because this is the point at which we face some of our greatest challenges. And this is particularly the case with our young people who are faced with a range of what we might call generously alternative views of morality in our schools. We have many problems in modern society today which are the result, we know, of not following the Bible's teaching. Unfortunately, most people in modern society haven't managed to catch up with this idea yet. And so we are confronted daily with the idea that the Bible's teachings on morality, on sexual ethics, on marriage and divorce and child-rearing are out of date. They're old-fashioned, they're Bronze Age, they're Stone Age, they don't work. Well, let's see if that's really true. We know the Bible encourages us regularly to take great care with what we see, what we hear, what we put into our hearts and minds. We all know the many passages. Paul's passage in Philippians is particularly important, encouraging us to think upon those things which are pure and lovely. We know the Bible places great emphasis on the care with which we should take when seeing and viewing things, the care we should take in putting things into our hearts and minds. We should be very careful, the Bible says, about what goes into our ears and into our eyes. And of course, there's a very well-known Sunday school song to that effect, and it's a very good song. It's very relevant. But of course, modern society finds this very restrictive. It finds ridiculous the idea that we should take such care about what we see, about what we hear. But in fact, modern professional surveys concerning these issues all come down very strongly on the Bible's side. And let's have a look at some of those surveys now. It is widely recognized that modern media is a danger to young people and even to adults. Smoking, alcohol consumption, sex and violence are prominent in television and even in computer games and comic books. Media messages related to children's developing sexuality usually promote rather than discourage. During this period of heightened concerns about attractiveness during the sensitive teenage years and sensitivity to cultural norms, children are bombarded with media messages that often promote, although usually indirectly, high-risk behaviour. Now this is important. Now we see, brothers and sisters, that especially in recent years, the backlash of the modern permissive society. Now that many longitudinal studies have been carried out, many professional surveys of developing children over the last few decades, modern social commentators and the modern professional scholarly literature is starting to realize that this great social experiment is having extremely negative effects. Now it's not just Christians, now it's not just conservative people such as ourselves who are saying you shouldn't be hitting children with all these messages, but it's social commentators, professional academics saying that really this is the worst thing we could have done. The importance of media is evident in findings that young adolescents who develop eating disorders are relatively more exposed to media, especially reading magazines and watching television soap operas. And again, as we look through this body of professional literature, we find the evidence just piles up and piles up. This study, as late as the year 2000, says, in addition, children may be exposed to violent, sexual or commercial content beyond their years as a result of exposure to television and computer games, with long-term negative effects. And this is the point. Even those surveys which have been done, which say, well, okay, there is definitely a correlation between modern media and bad effects, bad moral and ethical effects on children's outcomes later in life. Even though there is only a correlation, even though we won't be able to prove a direct link, there are no studies coming out saying, well, actually, this stuff is safe. There are no studies coming out saying, well, actually, we can continue to do this because nobody agrees it's harmful. Increasingly, the overwhelming conclusion of modern social commentators, the overwhelming conclusion of the latest professional surveys is that modern media is absolutely toxic, not only to adults, but especially to young people, and is causing many of the social ills with which modern psychologists and social commentators are wrestling today. Sexualized media is one of the worst, most pervasive and dangerous influences, and this is now becoming increasingly recognized. There is increasing evidence that youth exposure to sexual content on television shapes sexual attitudes and behavior in a manner that may influence reproductive health outcomes. Limiting adult exposure to the sexual content on television and balancing portrayals of sex in the media with information about possible negative consequences might reduce the risk of teen pregnancy. In other words, don't let them watch so much television which exposes them to these influences, and balance it with careful advice about why this behavior is high risk and will result in negative life outcomes. This kind of media puts children at risk, increased risk of desire for plastic surgery, early pregnancy and abortion, and sexually transmitted infections. And this was a major report carried out and presented in 2007, which utterly condemned modern media for its saturation of negative messages, especially for their negative impact on adolescents and the negative impact on their lives as they grew into adulthood. So increasingly now we find modern professional literature coming down on the side of the Bible, saying all this permissiveness, all this modern media, all these legislation which we've relaxed, encourage people to enjoy themselves more and try to play down these risks. All these messages which we have been sending, we are now reaping a most negative harvest. They are extremely dangerous and resulting in indisputable negative outcomes for children later on in their adult lives. The APHA further recognises that abstinence from sexual intercourse is an important behavioural strategy for preventing HIV, STIs and unintended pregnancy. Abstinence from sexual intercourse represents a healthy choice for teenagers, as teenagers face considerable risk to their reproductive health from unintended pregnancies and STIs, including infection with HIV. And now all the professional literature is saying remaining abstinent, at least through high school, is strongly supported by parents and even by adolescents themselves. So now we see the best of professional literature, and this is not simply in North America, but also studies in Europe, studies in Australia, studies in England, is all converging on one particular message. And it's the message that we have held and that we have taught all along. Sexualized media, sexualized content in books and magazines and computer games, and in particular the relaxing of sexual mores and laws among society has had a catastrophically devastating effect on young people and young adults and continues to dog them right into their later years. And now let's have a look at recent studies on the issue of divorce and single parenting. This is from a study in 2002. The weight of evidence indicates that the traditional family, based upon a married father and mother, is still the best environment for raising children, and it forms the soundest basis for the wider society. Now, all the literature that I'm quoting here is standard secular commentary. It's the latest professional secular literature. None of this is religious. These aren't religious think tanks. These aren't Christian commentators or theologians. These are people who are unbiased. They are simply surveying all the relevant standard secular professional studies. And this is the result of what happens to children who are the product of families which have suffered divorce. They suffer lower levels of psychological well-being. They are at risk for more health problems. They have greater risk of mortality, and they face more social isolation. This is from a major study which was reporting on cohabitation, marriage, divorce and remarriage in the United States in 2002. Children who grow up in families which have been subject to divorce and remarriage suffer more negative life events. They have greater levels of depression and alcohol use. They have lower levels of happiness and self-acceptance. And this commentator in 2002 wrote that many scholars and policymakers who study crime have identified family breakdown as one among a cluster of disadvantages which are associated with criminal activity and with chronic reoffending. So the Bible's advice about a stable family, about a mother and a father who look after their children well, is still the best advice for modern society. Contrary to what we may be told by the local village atheist, contrary to what we may be told by our friend at work or our fellow students at school, the Bible's advice is not out of date, it's not old-fashioned, it's the best possible advice that we could be given. Governments now, especially in places like Australia, are starting to try and encourage people to stay together. They're trying to minimize divorce, and they're trying to encourage people to take better care of their children and provide them with a better social environment. And governments are concerned with this, not simply for moral and ethical reasons, but simply for the very important reason that divorce is extremely expensive. It is clear, says this government report in Australia, it is clear that the costs to government of divorce last for 2 or more decades. Adverse outcomes accrue to children of divorce and, importantly, children raised in single-parent families. Most remarkably, and contrary to received wisdom, these studies indicate that living together before marriage substantially increases the chances of divorce for a couple, and numerous studies are cited there. This is a very useful study in 1995. It made a very comprehensive study of all the recent research on cohabitation before marriage and the impact on later life. It found that living together before marriage did not increase later marital happiness. It increased the chances of divorce. It increased the likelihood that parents would break up and leave children abandoned. It increased also the likelihood that children of cohabiting couples would have negative life outcomes. It increased the chance that those children also would later divorce in life and suffer even further negative outcomes. And the major conclusion of this study, which has been supported by many more recent studies, is that cohabitation is about the worst thing you can do, not only before marriage, but even if you are not married. And this is extremely important, especially for our young people to understand. There is a common wisdom that says that living together actually increases the likelihood that you will stay together afterward, or that living together is a better option than even getting married in the first place. But as you'll see, I can provide you with pages more information on this from far more relevant studies, far more recent studies, all the way up to about 2010. It is indisputable now that people who cohabit instead of getting married have far better likelihood of negative life outcomes. They have far less satisfaction with their partner. They have far lower general happiness levels, and their children are more at risk to negative life outcomes. Not only that, but people who cohabit before getting married are far more likely to get divorced later. Their children are far more likely to have negative life outcomes and are far more likely not only to be abused, but also to suffer addictions such as alcohol or drug abuse. So what we can see from this survey of the standard professional scholarly literature, the latest studies that the world can provide us with all its experts, is that the Bible's advice on marriage, on sexual issues, on general morality, on what we should put into our minds through our eyes and our ears, isn't out of date, isn't old-fashioned, isn't Stone Age and no longer relevant. It's in fact the best advice that we could possibly give. And in my book, and indeed, as I can email to you later, if you prefer, I can give you pages more of such quotations. And it's extremely important, again, for us to realize, brothers and sisters, it's extremely important for us to realize that now we have all the professional literature on our side. For years, people have been experimenting. For years, social psychologists have been proposing this model or that model and suggesting that maybe cohabitation before marriage is better. Maybe divorce doesn't really affect people and their children as bad as people suspect. But now the evidence is starting to pile up, and governments are finally paying attention because they are looking at the economic and the social cost of these practices which have been encouraged for so long. And now governments are sick of paying for repeat offenders who are the product of broken families. And they're sick of paying the economic cost of other people's divorces. And now they really want to fix it because it's getting way too expensive. Now, of course, they have a rather venal motivation for doing so, but the carry-home point for us is to understand that the Bible's teaching in this regard and on these subjects is not out of date. It's as relevant today as it always has been. And now we can see for ourselves why the Bible teaches us this way. And people have tried for decades. They have tried for decades alternatives to the Bible's teaching. They have experimented for 40 years with alternative models, and each of them has resulted in failure. And now we are reaping a very bitter harvest in society. And this is the message that we need to be getting out. Instead of being on the defensive, instead of being on the back foot, instead of having to try to apologize for what we feel are old-fashioned values, We can take the fight to them. We can cite all the relevant professional, peer-reviewed scholarly literature and say, well, what are you going to do about that? What are you going to do when the best of the world's experts today are coming down on our side? And now this is a very powerful weapon for our own young people to use as well. And they can use this information to defend themselves at university, to defend themselves at high school, to give sound secular reasons why they should follow the advice given by their parents, why they should follow the Bible's advice on how that they should live their lives. And we can see that, yes, the Bible's advice has been right all along. The Bible's advice has been the best all along. And doesn't that reassure us yet again, brothers and sisters, that this book was written by somebody who really does know what he's talking about, by somebody who gave us the best advice, that after 40 years of experimentation with alternatives, all the world's experts can only come to the same conclusion, and that social experiment has failed. And that the best advice they can give us today is the advice which we've been giving people all along. And it does provide very good evidence that that is a divine book, that the Bible was written by a loving Creator, by our Father who really does care for his children and gives us the best advice because he knows us. He knows us so well. And the advice which he gives us is, as we are children before him, something we may not understand at the beginning. Something indeed we may kick at first as something restrictive and painful. But later, as we mature into our adult lives, later as we grow up, as human society has grown up and gained more and more understanding, later, like adults, we come to a greater appreciation of our parents, a greater appreciation for our loving Heavenly Father, and finally, in the end, we realize he was right all along.